I am Bates Gill. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center. And on behalf of the Center and our sponsors for tonight, we want to thank you very, very much once again for coming. The United States Studies Center was founded 5 years ago. It was founded with a mandate to help improve the understanding and awareness about the United States here in Australia. This came about as the result of an Australian government initiative, and we are very, very fortunate to have the support of the Australian government, as well as a range of American companies who have, as well as Australian companies, but American companies who have a strong presence here in Australia. We have three major areas of our activity. One of the most important is our teaching function, where we today have something between 1,200 and 1,300 students, primarily from the University of Sydney, passing through our courses that we teach into degrees and majors at the University of Sydney. We also have a very large study abroad and intern abroad program. This year, through our programs, we'll be sending some 150 of Australia's brightest students, both from the University of Sydney and from the University of Western Australia, to study and intern opportunities in Los Angeles and in Washington, D.C., and soon in New York City. In addition, we have a very active outreach and public media presence in which we engage audiences as we are tonight, but also in various forms of media, again, to try to get out the word, try to get out some understanding, and to engage with Australians on issues of importance to them as regards the United States. And thirdly, we are undertaking what we call think tank research, in which we look at specific issues of interest about the United States or about U.S.-Australia relations, and we try to publish our results and make them widely available here and abroad. This is a growing institution, I'm very glad to say. We recently opened a sister campus at the University of Western Australia in Perth. You'll be hearing a lot more about that in the coming year as our activity trajectory really begins to ramp up with our sister institution in Perth. We are hoping soon also to formally announce the opening of an office of the United States Studies Center in New York, and we'll be giving you more information about that over the coming months as well. So we want to thank you very much for your interest and support in the Center. We look forward to continuing and deepening our engagement with you. Tonight we're joining under the banner of the Alliance 21 program, which is one of our major think tank undertakings. Thanks to the generous support of the Australian government through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, as well as support from other agencies, we were very pleased then to gain additional support from a number of corporate sponsors to take a look over a 3-year program at the breadth and depth of the U.S.-Australia relationship, what we call Alliance 21. And across 6 major themes of interest to the relationship, examining where we are today and where this very, very important relationship is going around certain issues such as defense and security affairs, natural resources and the environment, energy security, education and innovation, issues related to emerging Asia and what that means for this relationship, and last and certainly not least, on questions of trade and investment. And that is where we are tonight, to hear from 4 very interesting experts who are looking at the questions of trade and investment in the U.S.-Australia relationship. I'll just make a very brief introduction of each of them and then turn it over to our moderator for this evening. First, we're very, very pleased to have from the United States, from Washington, D.C., Sherman Katz. Sherm is currently a senior advisor at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress in Washington, D.C. Prior to this, though, he held a number of positions in American think tanks based in Washington, D.C., including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where we first had the opportunity to work together, as well as the Carnegie Endowment. And across the decades since the late 1960s, early 1970s, has worked as a lawyer as well as an advisor on trade policy to American government agencies, to American corporations, to international organizations, and also has been at the same time a sort of expert providing advice to Democratic presidential aspirants as well as incumbents on U.S. trade policy. We're very pleased that Sherm could join us. He's doing a lot of work these days examining U.S. trade policy, traveling around the world discussing these issues, and we're very glad he could share his insights with us tonight. We're also very pleased to be able to welcome Ambassador Virginia Greville. Ambassador Greville was, prior to her current position, ambassador in Chile, but also concurrently accredited to a number of other South American countries, including Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. She is currently the head of the New South Wales office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, based here in Sydney. I think interestingly for our discussions tonight, she was Australia's chief negotiator on the Australia-Chile Free Trade Agreement and has served in a negotiating capacity on a number of other trade agreement negotiations with other countries, including those in the Gulf and on a certain specific set of issues regarding agriculture with China. Thank you very much for coming, Virginia. Also, we're very, very pleased to have join us Huw McKay. Huw is a senior international economist, also executive director with Westpac Economics. He's been with Westpac since 2000 and has emerged as the bank's sort of leading spokesman on questions of Pan-Asia economic and market issues. His views widely sought by governments as well as corporate clients, and we're also very pleased to say the United States Studies Center, and have recently reached agreement with him for him to come on board and work with us in addition to his other responsibilities as a visiting expert. So thanks very much also, Huw, for joining. Last and certainly not least, we're very, very pleased that moderating tonight's activities will be Carson Scott. I know he's well known to all of you in this room, chief business correspondent with Sky News here in Sydney. He has a long career in journalism, which has spanned print and radio and television, and is excellent at delivering insights into what the markets are doing and their implications for Australia and beyond. I'm also very, very pleased to say that Carson just recently received the U.S. Studies Center World Press Institute Fellowship after a stiff competition with his colleagues here in Australia, and will be soon spending about 9 weeks in the United States under the auspices of the World Press Institute, traveling across the country, meeting with colleagues, sitting in editorial rooms, and learning about the business from the American perspective, as well as what's happening politically, economically, and socially in the United States. Carson joins a list of other very distinguished journalists who have received this fellowship, and we're very, very proud to count you as the most recent recipient. So, thanks once again. I turn the floor over to Carson Scott. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Bates, for that, and welcome to you all. It's very refreshing, actually, to be away from minutiae of markets, to come actually back to one of my first passions, which was and still is politics. So without further ado, let's bring in the experts. You've heard the introduction for Sherman. So Sherman, if you'd like to come up and set the scene for us and perhaps dispel some shatter some shibboleths or whatever, because I think China for us is, as you know, on our doorstep, but I'm just wondering whether we overplay it to our peril. I think you've got a fresh take on that. So let's begin with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bates, and thank you for the U.S. Studies Center's sponsorship of this. Delighted to be here. It's a pleasure. I need to clear the air before I begin. You may have noticed I'm wearing a blue tie. I just want to reassure you this is not a political statement. I am bringing to you this evening three perspectives, if you will. about U.S. trade policy. The first of them, perhaps slightly a surprise, is a kind of quick look at the strategic thinking about China, which the Obama administration undertook and which puts the TPP in a context that you may not yet have heard. The second perspective is that of our, we hope, new U.S. trade representative. He's been nominated, hasn't been confirmed yet. His name is Mike Froman, happens to be an old friend. I've known Mike about 30 years. And he last Thursday, June 6, testified at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Finance Committee. And that's an extraordinary opportunity to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, I think Mike would forgive me for that, what the trade policy, in fact, is going to be like. And the third perspective is from the members of the Senate Finance Committee who questioned Mike Froman. This, I think, gives us some insight into what the members of Congress who are the leaders on trade policy are thinking these days. So let me begin then with the first of these perspectives. And this perspective is informed by Jeffrey Bader. He was President Obama's top thinker in the White House on the National Security Council on our policy in China. And if you wish to read about his role in his making that policy, he's written a wonderful book on the subject called Obama and China's Rise, and I commend it to you. He suggests that the Obama administration had three principles in mind with respect to China. The first of these is that China should not be considered an inevitable adversary, but rather a potential partner in resolving critical global issues. Bader suggests that President Obama understood that there were competitive elements in this relationship, some of them quite significant, in both the economic and security areas, but he believed, the president believed, that the cooperative elements could and should outweigh those. And here I want to, apropos Carson's point about shibboleths, underscore that Washington did not seek containment as it did with the Soviet Union, both because of inherent differences between these countries and also because it would have been hopeless to seek to contain China, a country which is already so profoundly integrated into the global system. Rather, President Obama, according to Jeff Bader, understood that and welcomed a strong and prosperous and successful China that would play a stronger leadership role on global issues. So that's point one. Point two, while welcoming China's rise, the administration also believed that it was essential that this rise occur within the context of international law and norms. That meant that China should not resort to force or intimidation in resolving international disputes. It should conform to international economic norms, such as the rules of trade in the WTO and the rules of currency and finance in the IMF. And it meant that China should accept principles of freedom of navigation as embodied in the law of the Sea Convention. And it also meant that China should accept responsibility for curbing climate change and for living up to universal standards on human rights. Third theme and third foundation of this policy. The administration sought to ensure that China's rise would serve to stabilize and not destabilize the Asian-Pacific region. Here, allies in the Pacific and partners in the region shared a common perspective. None of them wanted to see, and I underscore this, the U.S. and China in conflict or rivalry that forced them to choose sides. And I think one can firmly count Australia in that group. At the same time, many of them, if not all, felt uneasy about this rise and what it might mean for their own security and their own interests. They believed that a strong U.S. presence in the region was critical to ensure that they were not under the exclusive sway of a dominant power with whom they had substantial historical experience, for better or worse. So, says Bader, there were three ways for us to achieve these goals. One, strengthen existing alliances, especially with South Korea and Australia, as well as building political and security relations with India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. 2, participate actively in emerging multilateral institutions of the region, especially the East Asia Summit, which, as you will recall, at an early stage, there were some in the region that wanted to exclude the United States from. And 3rd, strengthen, and perhaps most important for this evening's discussion, strengthen bilateral and multilateral trade ties in the region through agreements such as the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I hope it's useful to understand this solid, realistic, I think, and strategic thinking into which the TPP fits. Now, let me turn to the second perspective, and that is Mike Froman's confirmation hearing last Thursday before the Senate Finance Committee. As you probably know, Mike's statements provide an excellent window into what Obama's trade policy will be, not only because he's the USTR, but because in the first administration, he was the top White House advisor on international economic affairs. And in that capacity, he was the liaison from the White House to USTR. So Ron Kirk, who was USTR during that time, did nothing without the blessing and approval and substantial involvement of Mike Froman. So in his statement, Mike laid out, and some of this is boilerplate perhaps to Washington ears, but I think it's important to repeat while I have the good fortune to visit you. He laid out the following. He said, President Obama has made clear that our #1 goal must be to promote growth, to create jobs, and to strengthen the middle class. And Mike Froman said that he saw USTR's role as contributing to this effort in 3 ways. First, opening markets abroad to expand U.S. exports. Second, level the playing field so that U.S. competitors can compete and win in the global economy. And third, to ensure the rights and trade laws we have fought so hard to achieve in trade agreements are fully enforced and implemented in the carrying out of those agreements. Then, and now he comes to the regional initiatives that are underway. He said to the Senate Finance Committee, as we speak, USTR is negotiating TPP, and that was the first one of any of these regional deals that he mentioned. He also said we are consulting with Congress on the upcoming TTIP negotiations. This is the new acronym, as you know, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and this, of course, refers to the US-EU negotiations. And he said in consulting with Congress because there's a 90-day period of consultation before which the official negotiations with the EU cannot begin. And he also said in Geneva, we are working to energize trade liberalization, including through a trade facilitation agreement, which of course is part of, perhaps the only remaining part of, the Doha round, but also through an information technology agreement and through a services agreement, both of which will be plurilateral agreements under the umbrella of the WTO. He quickly added regarding these Geneva deals, it is better to have no agreement than to have a bad agreement. A sign, I think, of experience of a tough negotiator. He said these negotiations, and here nodding to the fact that the United States continues to put great stock in the multilateral system, the global system. These negotiations, he said, are designed to strengthen the multilateral rules-based trading system and press that system to achieve the greatest possible trade liberalization. He also said that trade, of course, is a powerful tool for development. And he pledged to work with Congress on renewal of the Generalized System of Preferences, I think you all know what that's about, as well as the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Both of those expire in the coming 18 months. On enforcement, he said the first-term Obama administration has instituted 18 cases at the WTO and also worked to implement the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center, which has helped prepare those cases. If you like, I can explain a little more about ITEC. Then Froman committed to work with Congress on fast track, or as it's become known, Trade Promotion Authority. This, as you probably know, gives Congress the chance to specify objectives and goals as we go forward on negotiating trade agreements. And at the same time, it gives our trading partners assurance that after these deals are fully negotiated, Congress will not amend them, but will cast simply a yes or no vote on them. So those are some of the things that Froman outlined. And I'm going to turn now to questions that the senators asked him. At the outset, I'm going to call your attention to the fact that not one senator questioned in any way, shape, or form the TPP initiative. I think that in itself speaks volumes about how significant a place this occupies, not only in the thinking of the White House, but also in the thinking of Congress, in a positive sense. Now, the questions from the senators fell in three groups. One, manipulation of currency by Japan, and that, of course, has big relevance to TPP. Two, our trade relationship with China, including currency manipulation. And three, violation of U.S. intellectual property. So let me turn to each of those three. And remember, the senators in the Senate Finance Committee are in the Tax Writing Committee. Tariffs are a kind of tax. And so each and every trade agreement we negotiate, including TPP, must ultimately be approved by the Senate Finance Committee, as well on the House side, the House Ways and Means Committee. On currency manipulation, Senator of Ohio, Rob Portman, himself a former USTR, mentioned to Mr. Froman that depreciation of the yen in Japan by 30% since last October gives Japanese car makers a $6,000 price advantage on a $30,000 car. He also noted that the U.S. exports one car to Japan for every 130 cars it imports from Japan. The other Ohio Senator, Sherrod Brown, mentioned that a recent study maintained that 1/2 of current U.S. unemployment is attributable to currency manipulation by other countries. Now, for a footnote, I want to leave the Senate Finance Committee to mention that last week, 230 of the members of the House, a body made up of 435, led by Sandy Levin, who is one of the titans of trade policy, a former chair of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, and from Michigan, where, of course, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler are located. 230 members sent a letter to the president insisting that new rules against currency manipulation be included in the TPP negotiations. Levin said in a press release about this letter that the letter, quote, sends a clear message that there is no point to negotiating in TPP to eliminate tariffs if, before the ink is even dry on that agreement, other countries are allowed to manipulate their currencies so as to wipe out the benefits of tariff reductions. He called Levin, and the letter called for action through legislation and trade agreements with the goal of creating an enforceable global agreement on currency. He added that, on the one hand, the IMF has no enforcement mechanism, but rather clear rules about currency. On the other hand, the WTO has a pretty good enforcement mechanism, but no clear rules about currency. And so he thinks there's a gap, as perhaps many of us do. In reply to the question, Froman said, and I quote, "No one cares more about the health of the U.S. auto industry than President Obama. So he has given me clear direction to make sure this issue is dealt with up front in the TPP with Japan." Froman mentioned more than once that negotiations with Japan on currency and on the auto industry preceded the decision in Washington to support Japan's joining the TPP negotiations. He also mentioned that the Abe administration has agreed that even after Japan enters TPP, Japan and the United States will continue parallel negotiations on autos and currency. One senator said that prior talks between the U.S. and Japan on these subjects, quote, give cause for skepticism. I think, as you all know, the relationship has been fraught with difficulty. We've had many promises. We feel, U.S. negotiators do, that the promises haven't always been kept. Froman did say that the TPP will have provisions on beef, autos, and insurance that will be binding and subject to dispute settlement. So, issue number one from several senators was Japan. And of course, while for TPP it is a major step forward to bring the Japanese economy into the talks, it is certainly from Washington a serious political challenge. Now, on China, the chairman of the committee, Senator Max Baucus, whose name I'm sure is familiar to you, asked Froman what leverage the U.S. has to get China to become open to investment at a time when it is aggressively investing and lending abroad. I don't know if you'll be struck as I was, but Baucus said that in 2012, China lent more abroad than did the World Bank. I tend to think of the World Bank as one of the hugest sources of financing and lending abroad in the world. China outdid them. Baucus said to Froman, now, I'm not interested in China bashing, but I want the U.S., a relatively open economy, not to be taken advantage of. And I underscore that not to be taken advantage of sentiment because it comes up again and again from various senators, and I think it is a sense, an idea, an emotion, if you will, whether entirely based in fact or not, which is widely held and shared in the Congress of the United States and in many voters in the United States. Froman said in response to Baucus's question, quote, there is no greater issue on our trade agenda than China. We are engaging them in what he didn't say we call, but we call the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, in a joint economic commission, in the WTO and the IMF. Froman continued, we are determined to press them for reform of their financial policies, for reform of their state enterprise sector. We have brought 8 cases in the WTO against China on manufacturing, on services, on agriculture. So we are using, said Froman, every enforcement tool, both bilaterally and multilaterally. On currency manipulation, Froman said the U.S. raises the subject with China at every meeting. He noted the U.S. Treasury Department has the lead on this issue, but repeated his readiness to work with Congress. He said there's been some progress since 2010 when the renminbi was allowed to float in a narrow band. The renminbi has appreciated 16%, but he said this is not fast enough or not far enough. Indeed, the issue came up again in the Xi-Obama meetings in California last week, and Froman assured the members of the Finance Committee it will come up again in July when there's another meeting of this strategic and economic dialogue between China and the U.S. Baucus noted in reply, quote, I urge you, Mr. Froman, to spend more time thinking about this. Figure out what leverage we have. Countries don't lower their barriers unless they have to. And later, at the close of the hearings, Senator Baucus raised this theme again. He said to Froman, quote, other countries are more results-oriented, while we think in the United States more about process. But, Baucus said, we need better results. That's why I ask you, as he had done a few minutes before, whether you, Mr. Froman, think that USTR needs additional powers. Froman, by the way, demurred on that, said, I'm not going to act as my own lawyer, and he didn't ask for any additional powers. But it's significant that Baucus, so frustrated about this question of being taken advantage of, said, we in this committee are prepared to think about additional powers if you tell us you need them. How do we make sure, he said again, that we are not being taken advantage of? And he noted to Froman, next time you come back to this committee, assuming he's confirmed, there will be follow-up questions. So the senators will be looking for results of the policies. Another senator put it more bluntly. He said to Froman, you are erudite and you are diplomatic in your responses to this committee. I want a USTR who at the end of the day will stand up. I hope your diplomacy will have limits. We are losing lots of ground. Again, I think indicative of the mood in Congress. So finally, third theme of the members of the senators, intellectual property. 3 senators, not 1 but 3, said India has invalidated and broken drug patents. One asked Froman whether India should be removed from the GSP system, particularly as long as China shuts U.S. companies out, here I'm quoting, forces them to share intellectual property as a condition of investing, and imposes compulsory licensing for drugs. Another said that India claims that these issues about drugs are questions of access, but he insisted that India could, and you may not think this is practical or fair, but he said India could observe the patent and then negotiate about the price. Froman did not make much of a response. He said he would look at the context, and he noted that GSP is about development as well as other issues. Another senator mentioned risks to IPR, particularly in the digital area, particularly U.S. Trade secrets on manufacturing processes. Another said more broadly that the U.S. is a global leader in intellectual property created through our intellectual capacity. And if products abroad undermine those rights, that changes and damages a key part of our economy. Froman agreed to work on this issue. Finally, another senator on a separate note, but an important one in the TPP context, mentioned state-owned enterprises. He said these are a big issue in TPP, one Congress has not thought very much about before. Froman agreed this is one of the new areas for TPP, that SOEs must compete on a commercial basis, adding that this is part of the U.S. dialogue with China. He did mention it, but of course, as you know, in Vietnam, which is at the TPP table, state-owned enterprises constitute about 40% of the economy. So, to conclude, 3 themes here. Number 1, China and its role in U.S. thinking about Asia and also about TPP. This thinking is, I think, large-scale, realistic, thoughtful, and it is not about containing China. Rather, it is more about engaging and eventually, not through TPP as such, but eventually bringing China into a partnership is too strong a word, but participation in working on global problems. 2, Froman, in his presentation to the Senate Finance Committee, clearly outlined an ambitious trade agenda, of which TPP is a very prominent part. 3, the questions of the senators highlighted continuing concerns about Japan, especially currency manipulation, continuing, and of course, at the top of the agenda, concerns about China and how we cope with this sense that we are being taken advantage of. And finally, this question of intellectual property, one of the crown jewels, so to speak, of the U.S. economy. So again, I thank Bates and the Senator, delighted to share these thoughts with you. Look forward to questions and comments with my colleagues and the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Magisterial Sherman, thank you so much. Virginia, because we are running slightly away from our schedule, I will invite you straight away to take to the lectern.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm going to try and touch on 3 main themes in my allotted time. A quick word about the Australia-US trading relationship, a slightly cheeky comment on US trade policy, and some words about the Trans-Pacific Partnership from an Australian perspective. And I'm sure there are as many views about all 3 of those as there are people in this room. And while my sources are quite good, I want to make the point that many of the comments and some of the analysis is mine alone and not an official Australian government position. I am not the custodian within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Australia-US trade relationship currently, nor am I part of the TPP negotiating team. However, to declare my biases, I was posted in Washington a decade ago and spent 3 years studying up close and personal the forces that combine to create US trade policy and the challenges inherent in that system. While I was there, for example, I observed the efforts and the rhetoric around the China PNTR vote in 2000, permanent normal trading relationships, the launch of the Doha round in 2001 and the efforts to secure Trade Promotion Authority in 2002. I watched the US negotiate its Chile FTA and the Central American FTA. And of course I was there for 9/11, so I saw the ANZUS Treaty being invoked for the first time. And for the 2 years after my return, I was engaged in negotiating and then implementing, which frankly was harder, the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, which entered into force on 1 January 2005. So those experiences have left me older and wiser, but I mention them mainly to explain, if not to excuse, any shrillness you may detect in my comments about trade negotiations with the US. Trade negotiators sometimes do get a little exercised, especially in the face of criticism from non-negotiators about outcomes. Not that you don't have every right to criticise, but sometimes what seems obvious and straightforward from outside the negotiation was completely impossible from within the cauldron that is the final stages of an important negotiation. So, to state the obvious, Australia's trading relationship with the US is one of our most important. A point that is sometimes missed in the chatter about the rise of China and the impact of commodity prices in our economy. The United States is our third largest trading partner in terms of trade in goods and services, but our most important economic partner when you consider overall trade, two-way investment ties and financial and banking flows. The US is our largest investment partner, with two-way investment valued at almost 1 trillion Australian dollars in 2011, and is the number one destination for Australian investment overseas. And importantly, Australia and the United States have a shared record of working together closely, where we can, to promote global trade liberalisation for more than 50 years. We've worked together in global and regional organisations like the WTO and APEC and the G20, and we look forward to continued cooperation in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Australia's close economic links with the United States and our cooperation internationally does not mean that we agree on all trade issues. Indeed, we have a number of concerns about US trade barriers, including, but not limited to, the size, and it has to be said the nature, of farm assistance packages and the existence of quotas on imports of agricultural products. I was an agriculture negotiator. And the negotiation of our bilateral deal with the US, while completed quite quickly, was a brutal and sometimes bloody encounter, metaphorically at least. So trade policy in the United States is hard to get a complete handle on, or to describe for that matter. Obviously, it's strongly influenced by the attitude and the level of ambition present in the White House, reflected by the Office of the United States Trade Representative, but also by the philosophies, prejudices and vested interests of members of the Congress, influenced by their various constituencies, which at the end of the day, Congress that is, has a much bigger direct role in trade policy development than is the case with our Parliament. However, our impression of US trade policy in this second Obama administration is that there is a greater sense of bipartisanship than has been present in the recent past, and certainly more than there is compared on high-profile issues like fiscal policy, tax reform or gun control. This seems to stem from a combination of the normal Republican support for trade, and they have the numbers in the House, and possibly a sense from some Democrats that maybe trade is not as hard as they had thought. The Democrats had the numbers in the Senate, but happily, Senate Democrats tend to be slightly less anti-trade than their House colleagues. And of course, it flows from the leadership of President Obama. The President mentioned trade, including TPP, in his State of the Union address, and indicated a certain priority for it, which I'm pretty sure does not always happen. Whether this translates to a willingness to use political capital to, for example, get Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, remains to be seen. And we, that is Australia, see the appointment as USTR of trusted White House advisor Mike Froman as a positive and important step. Not only is there bipartisan political support, apparently, for his appointment, along with industry support, but Washington insiders believe he had to be convinced to take the job, and would have been unlikely to do so without some assurance of an ambitious mandate to negotiate. And we assume that getting TPP up, with TPA wrapped up in that process, will be high on his personal agenda. The bipartisanship shouldn't be overstated, but my colleagues in Washington report that there is a sense of optimism on the Hill. They did pass 7 trade bills during the 112th Congress, and the administration also lifted its level of activity on trade in 2012, working to get Mexico and then Canada into TPP, and now Japan. But the optimism and the bipartisanship will be tested when the administration moves on Trade Promotion Authority. USTR Froman indicated in his Senate confirmation hearing that Sherman referred to that this is in the pipeline, but I imagine timing is an issue. Some comments made in the Froman hearing suggest that senators believe those discussions should be underway already. Apparently, Congress is not happy that USTR is involved in these important negotiations without a specific congressional mandate. But there is an argument, and perhaps the administration is making a judgment, that getting TPA will be easier, or at least less difficult, with the deal looming rather than some months off. Congress is always edgy about TPA, or fast track as it used to be called, as effectively it's binding itself. But only one agreement has passed Congress without it. And making sure that the process for getting any agreement through, but especially a complex plurilateral agreement like TPP, is via an up and down vote, is supremely important, not only to its supporters, but to the other negotiating partners. TPA is a crucial piece of the trade agenda puzzle. It will require presidential muscle, and it doesn't seem that he has flexed it yet. But it seems inevitable that the Republicans at least will lose patience if TPP negotiations reach or approach conclusion without a serious exchange between the administration and the Congress about TPA. And speaking of TPP, critics of the Obama administration on trade question his resolve and especially wonder whether he and his administration have the stomach to knock heads at home on tough negotiating issues like intellectual property, where, amongst many other things, the debate can be characterised as pitting the interests of big pharma versus the affordability of medicines. Rules of origin, where the US cotton industry is lining up against Walmart, for example, and the US Chamber of Manufacturers. And agricultural market access, beef, pork, and parts of the dairy industry, which have offensive interests, especially since Japan joined the negotiation, against the powerful sugar lobby. Our US trade colleagues have often said to us that the hardest negotiations they have to do are at home, and sometimes that's true. Australia's trade policy was spelled out in the Trade Policy Statement of April 2011. Everyone knows that the Gillard government attaches a very high priority to the Asia-Pacific region and APEC, and it's an APEC goal to one day achieve a free trade area of Asia and the Pacific. We see the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a pathway, via which a free trade area of Asia and the Pacific might be achieved. In a nutshell, the view that informs Australia's position in all of our trade negotiations is that the best trade policy is a productivity-raising, competitiveness-enhancing, microeconomic reform program supported by responsible fiscal policy. And so far, to be honest, we have had only varied luck in convincing our bilateral trading partners like China, Japan, India, and the Gulf Cooperation Council of the efficacy of our position, but TPP could be the key. So consistent with our views about what is the best trade policy, our stance in the TPP negotiations is that it must deal not only with the issues with which trade agreements have traditionally dealt, like tariffs and quotas and customs procedures, but also with the so-called 21st century issues. If it is to achieve the ambition of providing a platform for economic integration in the fast-growing Asia-Pacific region, it has to not only open trade in goods and services and boost investment flows, but also deal with regulatory and policy issues that currently complicate international trade and frustrate global business. It's our ambition, that is Australia's ambition, and I assume the ambition of all the parties to the negotiations, that the TPP will be what we call a living agreement. That means it will move with the times, but it also means that it's intended that other parties can accede to the agreement when and if they want to. So we see it as having the potential to set what could end up being not just new regional, but possibly global benchmarks and rules. So TPP is being billed as a 21st century agreement. And as I said, it aims to go beyond both those traditional elements and beyond borders to tackle issues like regulatory reform and coherence, supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, and improving development policy. And there is no doubt that this is an extraordinary opportunity for Australia to be involved in shaping a significant piece of regional economic architecture. We attach a very high importance to it, and we will do our best to deliver it within the timeframe set by leaders. But it's a really complex undertaking, not just because it involves 11 or 12 parties, but because of the range in size and level of development and the disparate interests of the parties. The danger is, and I stress that this is me talking now, not DFAT, that consensus could elude us on the important issues, or that the compromises necessary to reach an agreement dilute the deal too far. It's the nature of trade negotiations that each country goes into it with different priorities and sensitivities and will seek to prosecute its own interests and defend its own sensitivities. And, again, this is my personal view, the US cannot have it all its own way. The US will be defensive regarding textiles, apparel and its own agricultural policies, and will be on the offensive regarding Japan's agricultural policies and on automobiles and services policies, and on many other issues like the very important role of state-owned enterprises in Vietnam. From the perspective of non-US parties, I think it's a good thing that Mexico, Canada and Japan have entered the group, even though it's hard to see how that will not slow down progress. Other powerful economies, and I guess I mostly mean the non-NAFTA partner, Japan, with interests different to the United States, will add a new dimension, albeit a complicating one. But at the very least, it will provide an incentive for some powerful US industry lobbies like beef and dairy, which resisted market openings in our bilateral FTA, to work for this agreement, not against it. I'll finish up by adding a note of warning, and I stress again, this is my warning, not DFAT's or the Australian government's. TPP is a 21st century proposition which will, when and if completed, have a lasting positive effect on regional and perhaps global trade into the future. But it still includes those pesky traditional mercantilist considerations, like the elimination of tariffs and quotas. And some, at least, of the parties know that they will be judged in their important domestic political constituencies by what they bring home in those arenas. It would be a pity to see a groundbreaking 21st century agreement founder on 20th century considerations. Thanks.
There's strains of Doha all over that one. Huw, without any further ado, can I invite you to come up to round out the presentations before we get underway with our discussion? Thank you. Huw McKay.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Bates for the invitation. I'm indebted to both of my predecessors at the podium. First of all, for coming up with a better catch-all term for TPP, a 24th century agreement. I had come up with the Grown-Ups Club in the sense that it's very much a post-industrial agreement and a post-industrial agenda, given that its key advocate, the United States, is very much meets that description. And I'm also indebted to Sherman for introducing a new concept to me, or through you as a medium, the Congress, the US economy as ingenue, a little naive, possibly ready to be taken advantage of. The US economy and US Congress fascinates me from a distance, and the concept that the US is not able to take care of itself and is being taken advantage of strikes me as a little curious from a distance. Now, my remarks are very different because I'm not someone who works in trade policy day to day. I do work in financial markets, and I'm a macroeconomist who deals with trade as one of the endogenous factors in a bigger story. And when confronted with this topic, I thought perhaps the most constructive way to come at it was actually think about the TPP from the other side of the Pacific and say, well, okay, I'm one of the big 5 economies in emerging Asia. What might be in it for me? Now, a US congressman might say, where's the leverage where I can crack something open? But the best agreements tend to be driven by trust and self-interest on both sides, which happens to be complementary through luck rather than good management. So what is in the TPP for the key economies in Asia, and why should they be interested? Well, I'm actually quite optimistic on this front. I actually think there are some very sound reasons for the large economies on the western side of the Pacific to start thinking about the TPP in a fashion where the perceived opportunity may well begin to outweigh the perceived risk of entering into that sort of grouping where there is an economy at the heart of it who is larger than you are. And prima facie, you tend to see as a threat when it comes to access to your own markets. Now, my optimism revolves around a point of view that Asia's Big Five actually need more foreign penetration in their home markets than they presently do. And that isn't just a neoliberalist, neoclassical opinion. It's an assertion that I make because productivity drives living standards, competition drives productivity, and whether you're a wealthy country in Asia, a middle-income country in Asia, or a low-income country in Asia, all of those things can help you today as well as tomorrow. Now, Japan, it's a grown-up. It's ready for a 21st century agreement, and it certainly needs new growth engines. And there's been a number of modelling studies over where the low-lying fruit reside in Japan and its services sector productivity. TPP, of course, is driven by market access, FDI and services sectors, making the previously non-traded traded. That's where your competitiveness comes through. And the speeches which Prime Minister Abe has been giving in the election campaign and afterwards, the third arrow of Abenomics is all about structural reform and driving competition internally, opening up and using the stick of foreign competition, if you will, to drive productivity gains. That's the argument for Japan. For China, China is actually also in search of a new growth model. Not growth engines per se, but a new model. It also needs a more equal distribution of income inside its economy between elites and the rest. And the regime has recognised this. But if you also look at the Chinese economy, its goods markets are already quite open. And parts of its economy are already feverishly competitive. Some parts are not. That's where state-owned enterprises come in. That's where your competition policy comes in. And that's where foreign ownership caps in strategic sectors come in. There's a number of things which a TPP-like agreement could do to actually expedite what the current administration is trying to do in reorienting the growth model, limiting opportunities for rent seeking inside the system, and or redistributing the rents once they're accrued. Is China ready to leap straight in? Well, probably not. But it is now a middle income economy, and we should consider it in that context. And it may not be as long as we think before it actually projects itself as someone who has grown-up problems, just as Japan and the United States have grown-up problems. Now, in the interest of time, which has sped away, I won't comment specifically on India, Indonesia or Korea here, but I will just conclude and I'll try and put this in a more global context. The world economy before the financial crisis was driven and sustained by the inflaming of imbalances between key economies. And once you take out the German economy and you take out the oil producers, those imbalances are very much trans-Pacific in nature. Now, the peak of the imbalances was 2007, and they've unwound considerably, but not totally. And I think that a situation which allows the US to increase its export penetration by leveraging its comparative advantages to the nth degree, high technology, high quality services. And on the other hand, it enables a reorientation of growth models in East Asia by driving productivity in the services sector, boosting living standards thereby, and becoming less reliant on the export of goods. It assists global imbalances, it assists the US economy, and we have the third corner of the triangle. It actually assists the countries themselves. Now, it's very, very difficult to push unilateralist reform. You need political cover. Whether or not you're a democracy or some other political regime that still has a lot of stakeholders and vested interests internally that need to be convinced if you want things to get done. And I think there is an argument that can now be put. And it may seem too simple, but the idea that I'm missing out is quite a powerful emotion. And if the grown-ups, i.e. the wealthy countries in the region, do move forward, that may well provide the political cover that will provide an opportunity for middle-income countries and those who are just behind middle income to use that very, very basic human emotion to push things along internally. I'll conclude my formal remarks there and turn over to my moderator.
Thank you, Huw.
Thank you.
Right, I hope everyone can hear now. We're onto these mics. I take it you can, so because I can hear it, so that's probably a signal I'm half deaf as it is. Can we maybe just start with those remarks, Huw, that you've just left us with, particularly the political cover to get things done? Just strikes me that Japan has featured in each of these conversations, and yet here we are with Abenomics and the third arrow. He's back for a second bite of the political cherry, and you know, if history is any guide, he'll be on his way in 12 months. So, you know, where's the actual confidence there to see that, you know, the third arrow gets some stickability before we even worry about currency manipulation defences that are going to be levelled against it if it is going to sit down at the table of Malaysia in a couple of months on joining the TPP?
Well, on the Japanese, we're yet to see a lot of granular detail on the third arrow, but TPP is one of the most concrete things that we have been able to evince from Abe on this front. And it's not impossible that in 2 years' time we realise that Abenomics was really about extravagant monetary policy and a weaker yen. That's possible. But just because you know, Abe didn't do very well last time doesn't mean that he can't succeed this time. And we have the example of a more charismatic man than Abe in Prime Minister Koizumi, who had a pet policy and he drove it through. And he survived 2 terms very, very easily. Now, his pet policy was too narrow to change the Japanese economy a great deal. Abe's pet policy is actually universal. He wants to affect the key relative price in the economy, which is the exchange rate, and he wants to boost aggregate productivity.
He needs to be a Gerhard Schroeder, though, doesn't he, quite frankly? And do the people have the stomach? I'm just wondering, Virginia, if you've got a view on this, do you think the Japanese people have the stomach to even allow the foreign investment that Huw's talking about? That's requiring a complete cultural mind shift at the moment. I mean, these kind of mentalities don't die with just one prime minister.
No, I agree with you, and I don't have a particularly expert view on this, but I mean, Australia's been negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan since 2007 or something, and here it is 2013. And one of the elements on which it has not progressed is Japanese agricultural policy. So I'm not sure to what extent currency manipulation conversation takes place. I suspect very little. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is a very widespread appreciation in Japan that they need to do something about agricultural reform. And nobody so far has had the stomach or the guts or the votes to be able to do it. And so I guess to me it just seems like it's a balancing act. It depends what you've got in the plus side that will justify going through the political pain and possibly losing your job in the way that Japanese prime ministers tend to. But I mean, we have the same concerns when we negotiate a free trade agreement. I mean, we accept sometimes in FTAs things that are politically unpopular. We are luckier than the US, for example, because, as I said before, our parliament doesn't have the same kind of power of veto that the US Congress does. But it's still uncomfortable. I mean, I will go to my grave remembering how it was for us presenting the outcomes of the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, which on balance was a fabulous agreement, but we still got beaten up left, right and centre. So there was a lot of political, feeling out there about what we had or hadn't achieved. I mean, in Japan...
What's the secret to still standing at the end of that one? You say you get beaten up,
well,
you're saying
you just, I think,
before.
have to have an argument that says that the national interest is best served by this balanced package. And okay, well, what the then government, the Howard government, said about the US Free Trade Agreement was, okay, we didn't get anything on sugar and we didn't get the best deal possible on dairy, but on balance, we achieved more than anybody else has ever achieved in a free trade agreement with the US at that time. And we are set to benefit from it significantly. And in our system, that worked. I mean, the Japanese agricultural culture is a bit more entrenched and a bit more difficult, but it ends up being the same kind of political calculation, I think.
Sherman, how important is it in the United States perspective that the people are carried with you on this, that the politicians might put up arguments, one of which you, and correct me if I got this down right, 1/2 of unemployment is attributable to currency manipulation. That seems an extraordinary statistic just to kind of, laconically put, before a committee. What was it based on? I'm intrigued. How can that just be said so baldly with no kind of, I suppose, verification for it?
It came from the Peterson Institute in International Economics, which is a pretty well-regarded shop. I haven't read the study yet myself, but you touch on a theme that comes back to something Virginia said about not having the veto. Remember, please, that the Constitution of the United States gives all power over commerce, both between states and with other countries, to the Congress of the United States. And everything that the President of the United States does in trade policy is pursuant to delegated authority from the Congress to the President. So it's, if I may amend slightly, it's not only veto power, it's the emanation of power on trade policy, lodging in Congress. And of course, for a variety of reasons that you know, a lot of them having to do with money and politics, the Congress of the United States is deeply in thrall to vested interests, in particular its own constituencies. And so to come back to your question, bringing the Congress along and bringing people along on trade policy is enormously important.
And there will always be flashpoints like the currency manipulation, like the stats on autos. But I'm wondering, do you risk kind of tearing asunder a nascent agreement by, I suppose, inflaming the other side? You were at pains, for instance, to talk about China's participation and not its partnership under this. Now, it's subtle in that distinction, but it's possibly, even from a Confucian perspective, a huge insult.
Well, remember Ross Perot and how many votes he won in an election when he talked about NAFTA as a giant sucking sound. I mean, there's, if I may say, little shame, at least among our politicians, I won't speak to Australian ones, who are running for office to stretch the truth. And unfortunately, this often finds a very willing audience. And let me add a footnote here. We have 50 states, we have a federal system, we have a mandate in the Trade Agreements Act of 1962 to provide adjustment assistance to those workers who are negatively impacted by trade. We have never done a very good job in the United States, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I saw this firsthand growing up, with helping those parts of our industry that are hurt by trade. So again, this underscores the fact that there's room for distorted rhetoric, to create paranoia about trade beyond what it deserves.
Each of you have touched in your own way on currency. If I can bring it back to China and the importance of its involvement or not, if we look at history as far as the Doha round goes, Virginia, you could see there how China was, as it were, a locus of so much distrust amongst other developing countries, because, you know, why would you agree to further reductions in tariffs if you could see a flood of cheap imports just carrying on into infinity because of an undervalued yuan? So if that was happening then, what makes you think the argument doesn't become altogether circular again this time round? And it will all just go back on the United States, and they'll be called the arch currency manipulators.
Well, I was about to make that point, and I say this in full knowledge of the fact that I'm not an economist and I know very little about currency manipulation. But what I do remember very clearly, when I was in Washington as the Minister Counsel of Agriculture, we were engaged in a WTO case with the US. They had taken us to the WTO on a lamb safeguard. They took us to court saying that we were subsidising unfairly our lamb industry because they couldn't understand how we could produce good lamb and sell it in the US at that price. And at that stage, the Australian dollar was worth 50 cents US, and we were accused constantly of doing that on purpose. You know, you're manipulating your currency, and that's how come you can land lamb in this country so cheaply. I mean, I'm pretty sure we weren't manipulating our currency, but I do, add to that I wouldn't know if we were.
So how do you get some? I suppose, how do you walk away from that feeling you've won the argument?
Well, I mean, the argument on lamb was actually simpler. I mean, the point on lamb that the Americans needed to understand was, we're just better lamb producers than you are, and we have. And I'm a diplomat, so I said that really carefully. And we have sheep farms with 15,000 sheep on them, whereas your average American lamb farmer at that time had 90 sheep. And it wasn't unusual or incomprehensible that we were better, more efficient producers of lamb than they were. So we won the WTO case. But my point is that currency manipulation is something that's easy to say, it's hard to prove, and I don't pretend to know how you do it. At the time that China acceded to the WTO, which was the China PNTR vote, was what obsessed the American trade lobby for the first year I was in the US. I don't think currency manipulation was the concern. I mean, the concern was cheap imports, but that was just because things are cheaper in China. China has a comparative advantage because they pay their workers next to nothing. I mean, that was the line, which is, probably true. But currency manipulation is, I think, something that's become more in vogue in that conversation in the last 5 years than it was in those 5 years. But I'm sure Huw knows much more about currency manipulation than I do.
Come in on that one if you could.
There's a number of issues. I think that the Peterson Institute you cited, I think that precise numbers on currency valuation is extremely mischievous, and I think then trying to take that mischievous number and bring it back to jobs is mischievous to a certain exponent, probably greater than 2. So I'm very, very wary of that. And even in the confirmation hearing, you actually cited a specific number in your remarks, which was a 16% appreciation since 2010. But China actually unpegged its currency in 2005, and people rarely talk about that. It's actually up more than 30%. It's actually leapfrogged the original Peterson Institute estimate of undervaluation, and it's possibly overvalued based upon their first stab in the dark. So these things do move around a lot. To say the Japanese are manipulating their currency, I think is ignoble. To say that Toyota now has a $6,000 advantage per car is another way of saying they had a $6,000 disadvantage previous to Abenomics. Japan was actually having a terrible time with a vastly overvalued yen because other advanced countries put their interest rates to 0. But no one else was actually in deflation like the Japanese. And Japan wasn't actually actively going out and buying private sector assets inside their economy as the United States was. So it's a very, very slippery slope to point to the Japanese. There were times when they used to intervene in the exchange rate very aggressively when they were trying to put a line in the sand. They failed. And they really haven't accrued foreign exchange reserves in any magnitude since 2003. And the Chinese, since the middle of 2012, haven't really accrued many foreign exchange reserves either. So a lot of these arguments, I think, are actually their pre-financial crisis arguments. They were relevant at a time, but things have moved on considerably.
Sherman, things that haven't moved on necessarily, even though we got a bilateral deal between South Korea and the United States after a lot of, 5 years of very vicious backwards and forwards. The auto argument to be winning that inside the United States, let alone taking it to other potential members of the TPP. We're having discussions on autos even in Australia right now with beleaguered multinationals wondering whether to stay put or bail. How does it sort of, what lessons rather were learnt from that bilateral that mean that the United States doesn't have to go back to square one and endure more bickering and slow down the process yet again over issues like the autos and the options and issues like the farming subsidies for its own workers?
The jury is still out. Initial numbers that I've seen on the benefits to the United States from the FTA with Japan are modest.
Korea.
Korea, though.
Korea.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
Korea. Yeah. Obviously, I have Japan on my mind. So I think it's too soon to say what the lessons are. But you prompt me to come back to Hugh's comment about this naivete in the United States not taking care of itself. Consider this. Max Baucus is from Montana. His principal interest in trade negotiations has been beef. It is now beef. It will always be beef. I don't mean to say that beef isn't perhaps a window on the world, but there are other things involved. And Virginia, who's worked there, I don't know, might agree that despite the enormous juggernaut of the U.S. economy, there are still weak spots, and members of Congress get driven by the weaknesses. And so you may consider it naivete, but it's a political fact.
I couldn't agree with you more. A political fact based on the way that your system works and the way that the respective Senate and House committees work and the level of approval or disapproval that they have as their gift. It is one of the things that amazed me when I was working in the US, and this will sound very rude and I apologise, is that despite that system and despite the vested interest which was so clearly apparent, especially in the Agriculture Committee, but in others too, every so often they get a really good piece of legislation. Where, it was never surprising when the legislation was bad. What was surprising was that sometimes it was good.
Let me add a footnote at the risk of taking too much time. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt who went around the United States in the 30s during the Dust Bowl when we had small family farms. And that was the origin of subsidies in the United States. And, the LDP and farmers in Japan, and I won't speak about Australia, but when you create these subsidies, it's very difficult to take them away, even though you may now have huge 100,000-acre farms, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not appropriate at all. And indeed, Charles Stenholm, who was chairman of Agriculture Press when you were there, was a Texas cotton farmer. And of course, observing ethics and so on, when he came into the agriculture chairman position, he turned the farm over to his son. Well, he still had a very serious vested interest in agriculture.
I want to turn the discussion out to the audience just a sec, but just before we do that, because of the necessity of time, Huw, we haven't really touched on Europe, but it is, after all, the United States' largest trading partner. We've been talking about relatively, you might just classify them as emerging, to leave out Japan, emerging economies and the clout that they're looking to input into these discussions. Conversely, does the US have more of an advantage in getting an agreement up and running with the EU before this TPP?
You may want my help, but go. You go.
Yeah, no, I'll hand straight to you, Sherman, I think, on that one.
The short answer is absolutely not.
I agree.
Right. If not, why not?
No, well, because the obstacles in US-EU are very deep. They have to do with cultural traditions, about SPS, about all kinds of behind-the-border regulatory institutions. It's going to take a long time to sort those out. As
So
between
an
the US and
even more cultural kind of divide than Asia. More of a cultural divide, you're saying. Europe is a harder nut to crack.
Well, you might consider a divide the fact that very few countries in Asia have meaningful competition policy. Mm-hmm. So doing anything meaningful on competitiveness is going to take years.
They've got a meaningful competition commissioner.
Well,
Nearly crows.
No, I'm not talking about. Yes, in the EU.
Yes,
but
correct.
Okay, my point is that yes, there are huge cultural divides which are going to take very long to sort out. And on the other hand, there's huge lack of capacity in many Asian countries on areas where we in the United States want to move along.
Let me put another way, though, back on you, Huw. Who needs the agreement more right now? Europe, in its quest to get out of a funk, or emerging Asia?
Who needs the agreement? Well, look, I think that in areas where Europe has competitive advantage, they've actually got very good international market access. You don't see German exporters struggling to sell their capital goods or their automobiles around the world, and you don't see French luxury goods makers having the same problem. What Europe has is an internal problem, in that, unlike the United States, which is a very effective currency union, the European Union is a dreadful mess. And I don't think that they frankly, they wouldn't have the technocratic resources to start thinking about external problems, because their internal malaise is so substantial. They're trying to actually bring about pan-European banking union, regulation. If you say all politics is local, that's going to take them a decade.
And I would just add to that, I mean, the EU and the US already have an extraordinarily healthy trading relationship. So market access per se is not the problem. That's not to say that they don't have problems with each other's regulatory systems, what have you. But the value of the agreement, when and if they conclude it, will be about the rules and the standards. And the difference between that and the TPP, I mean, there are huge difficulties in the TPP, don't misunderstand, but to some extent, Australia and the US and Canada and Mexico have already some universe of shared views about regulations, which they would clearly like to impose on other TPP partners who don't have a competition policy or don't have a government procurement policy. And I mean, that's a difficult job to impress upon them that this is the way they should go. But at least they don't have to abandon anything to go that way. Negotiating with the European Union, which has, I think I just lost my battery, which already has its own competition policy and its own, SPS policies, which are fundamentally different to the US, and its own. Reaching a compromise or getting one to change to the others is a huge job that's going to take a long time, it seems to me.
Just very quickly on that point, one thing that Europeans could actually perhaps take umbrage at, and I think all countries outside the United States are feeling the pinch here, is that the US is a centre of the global financial system. And the Dodd-Frank Act and the regulation which is coming around that is actually making it much more difficult for international financial institutions to do business in the United States or do business with the States from without. And Europe's banking system, for better or for worse, is one of their major exporters. And their globally engaged banks would probably like to discuss Dodd-Frank.
Just a footnote to that, the Treasury Department has already made very clear to the EU that market access, okay, that's on the table. But regulations, internal market supervision, not on the table. So there's a serious difference on just the point that you made.
Listen, I want to thank all three of you, and we will acknowledge you formally in just a moment, but can we, I think there's a roving mic, let's take that opportunity to open up to the floor. Here we are, if you could just kick it off, thank you.
Yeah, my name's John Hutchison. There is a view that Rome expanded so they could get enough food for the growing population in Rome. Now, China has a unique geographical position with quite juicy trade from neighbours, as far away perhaps as Indonesia and the Philippines. Australia and United States are a long way physically and secondly culturally from China. Now, one should know one's enemy before one starts the battle. What does China want, in particular, from Australia and the United States, if anything, from TPP or any other agreement?
You want to put that to one of us or several of us?
Well, I think the last speaker started the thing,
Okay.
but all I've heard tonight is about trade inside the United States and battles inside the United States, whereas we came here to
there's a
talk
few of them.
about something else.
Well,
But China's not actually part of the TPP at this point. I mean, I appreciate that's not the thrust of your question, but at the moment the TPP negotiating parties do not include China.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but, you know, who are you going to trade with if you don't try and trade with China?
Okay, well now I will pick up a point there, and this was actually in my prepared remarks, but I compressed them for time. China does have an incentive in adult problems. China is now a very large holder of international assets. Most of these assets are parked in low-risk financial products, and they are trying to parlay that stock into other assets, technology, franchise value, resources. And they are finding that that is actually not the easiest thing to do, and just being able to pay the price tag is just the start of a negotiation. So I think the Chinese actually have very, very strong interests in universal rules of market access. The issue is there's always, well, what are you going to do back home? And that's where China, of course, falls down now. And China has got this mega market domestically that is a lure for multinationals, and it remains a lure, despite that some of them lose a lot of money as well as some of them make it. But as time goes by, that's going to be less of a lure as people get, it's demystified, and they're going to have to give up some things like ownership caps and the commanding heights of the economy. But they will want something back, and they will want their technology firms to be allowed to bid. They will want to be involved in the government procurement process in other countries. They will want to be treated as an equal bidder in auctions for resource assets. Just as Japan went through a process where they were unwelcome in the West to begin, and they just they earned trust over time. China wants to go through that process, but it's doing it quicker and earlier and at a lower level of income, and that's what's making it very awkward.
A couple more, briefly. Yes, please, the lady in the black.
Well, he's got a microphone.
Okay, you've got a mic. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see you had one. Okay.
George from UCIT. For Sherman, my question is, so currently we have a big deal for the Chinese second largest food producer is already announcing a bidding of the Smithfield. Right. But there's a concern that the Smith has a few farmland in the states where the state has a legislation against the foreign ownerships of the farmland in the states. So what do you see the future risk or like opportunities between the US, China bilateral investment trade in agricultural commodities, and what kind of impacts on the Obama's the trade policies in the next, in his administration? And to the Australian fellow, so given the coming, the Julia Gillard's the enthusiasm, strong enthusiasm for signing FTA on agricultural commodities, so what do you see? What can Australia learn on that cases? On the large bilateral trade between US and China, and also for the economists. So what kind of like risks on the interest rates would be a pressure on Australian farmers especially
maybe just because
You
of
won't
time.
get to me.
I was saying maybe just take the first part of that question if we can.
That's you. That's yours.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question that really, at its root, gets to the interplay between the federal government and the states. Again, we have a system where the federal government only has such powers as the states gave to the federal government. And when it comes to ownership of land, when it comes to whether a license to practice law can be recognized, which is also controlled by the states, the federal government has only what you would call best efforts power to persuade states to go along with deals which are negotiated internationally. Now, this doesn't come up all that often, but as our economies integrate more and more, it is going to come up more frequently. In general, one should say that the major reservations about Chinese investment have been at the federal level. They've been with oil, with respect to national security, but it could be that this will be a second inhibiting factor.
One more. Yes.
Thank you. Carson, just to extend your question about who needs this the most, throwing Australia into the mix there, how much does Australia need this in relation to our FTA negotiations with Japan and South Korea, noting what you stated before, that America has sort of overtook us in terms of our FTA with South Korea? I don't know, maybe Virginia, given your insight into FTA negotiations, how quickly do you think those will happen, and also the impact on our relationship with China and America? How much does Australia need it?
Well, I think, as I said in my remarks, I mean, Australia sees this as an extraordinary opportunity to be in on the design phase of a piece of regional economic architecture. In terms of market access, you know, we have bilateral market access ambitions with Japan that we've been pursuing in our negotiations. I mean, and it's kind of complicated a bit, I suppose, by the fact that there's now TPP. We tried to convince the Japanese that the best way to show their credentials to get into TPP would be to finalise the bilateral agreement with us, and they could therefore demonstrate that they could achieve the level of ambition, which is one of the tests. Now, they chose not to do that. So, I mean, I think TPP will actually help us finalise our Japanese negotiation as long as TPP doesn't take too long. Korea we're very close to. I mean, Korea is not actually in TPP at the moment, so I don't think the Korea negotiation will be influenced particularly by TPP unless Korea shows an indication to want to join and tie the two up together. But they are a bit different. And the way the market access negotiations are being handled in TPP is different to the way you handle market access negotiations bilaterally. So, I mean, I think we have a lot to gain because we want to be in at the design phase of what could be the beginning of an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement. In terms of, pure market access, we have free trade agreements with a number of the TPP partners already, and we have very good market access agreements with them. Some of the others we don't, but they're not huge markets for us. So, I mean, it's not really a market access negotiation for us so much as those other 21st century agreements. But the point I made still stands. You nevertheless have to get market access. There has to be some market access. Otherwise, the constituency back in Australia will say, well, what did you get out of that? All that effort that went into TPP. Did you get sugar in the US? Did you get a better deal on beef into Japan? And if you didn't, then a number of people will question you.
This will have to be the last, so up the front, yes.
Sam Silva is my name. I'm not an economist. I'm just an ordinary guy.
Me neither.
I'm just an ordinary guy out in the street. Originally a civil engineer. I'm in the business of advising the Commonwealth and the states on investments in infrastructure to boost up our capacity of the economy, to improve productivity, the competitiveness, and improve living standards, as Huw mentioned. I got an example project I would like to ask all of you to shed light on. The liquefied natural gas industry. Everyone's focused on environmentally friendly energy initiatives nowadays because of global warming and so on. A couple of issues. USA is competing with Australia in terms of pricing because Australia is not competitive because of the high dollar and other factors, global effects on our economy, right? And also the China factor or Japan currency manipulation, you see, that will put us on a disadvantage, if you like. So without China bashing, you see, how can, as Sherman mentioned, how can we invite China to the table to come into the dialogue? Timothy Geithner, the recently departed Treasury Secretary, made a blunt statement, but it was not strong enough, you see. But with the TPP, what can we do to invite China to be to the party, you see, because LNG is an initiative, everyone's talking about it, you see. A couple of issues. US is competing with Australia in terms of selling exports, right? Exports, and China factor is affecting both US and Australia. You see.
So in other words, in the tussle for markets, where you've got two providers here, the United States and China and Australia, how would that resolve itself under the TPP model? Well, or is that even going to be discussed?
Is that very brutal?
Well, if I could quickly come in.
Go ahead.
The US Congress was looking for leverage. Unconventional gas reserves and the technology to extract them is something which the US absolutely leads the world. China, of course, has very large reserves of unconventional gas itself. It does not know how to get to them. This is a strategic sector. The Chinese have kept foreign ownership far, far away from their energy sector, except in this particular space where they have had to go into a joint venture with international capital because that's where the technology is. So this is a sector where there is quite an unusual sector where there's very clear leverage in a very important part of the economy, and China has been very pragmatic about it and said, sure, come in, show us how.
Okay. I think we're going to have to rule a line under that. I want to thank all of you, Huw McKay, Virginia, and of course Sherman. Appreciate it. Please put your hands together. Thank you very much.